Welcome in. We're ready to jump straight into today's deep dive, and I really have to warn you right at the top. What we are unpacking today is going to demand a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah, a massive one.
If you are someone who has spent any time reading ancient scripture, you probably have a framework for how it all operates, a modern 21st century framework. But today, we are asking you to temporarily set that lens aside.
You really have to, or none of this is going to make sense.
Right, because we have a huge stack of material in front of us that reconstructs the worldview of the ancient biblical authors. We're looking at texts exploring cosmic geography and the divine territorial order, a really comprehensive breakdown of Dr. Michael S. Heiser's work in the unseen realm.
Which is phenomenal, by the way.
It is. And we also have detailed analyses on territorial spirits, the cosmic governance of nations, the sacred peaks of biblical cosmic geography, and finally, a paper called The Singular Sovereign.
It's a heavy stack of research. And the operative word you just used there is reconstruct, because we are attempting to step out of our modern Western, highly individualized way of looking at the spiritual world.
Exactly.
We want to reconstruct the worldview the biblical authors actually breathed and lived in. Not the worldview we project onto them, but the one they took for completely granted. And that worldview is defined by a deeply populated unseen realm and a highly structured cosmic geography.
The mission of this deep dive is to rebuild what these scholars call the divine council worldview. We are going to track the logical progression of the biblical narrative, moving from a flat, basic idea of foundational monotheism to recognizing a really complex spiritual hierarchy.
Right.
And we're going to see how that shift totally rewrites our understanding of human history, geopolitics, and what the ancient writers actually meant by spiritual warfare.
And we should probably clarify our approach here right at the start.
Yeah, please do.
Because we are dealing with theology and ancient religious texts, we are looking at this purely through an academic and textual lens. We are analyzing the linguistic and historical arguments presented in the research to understand what the ancient writers were communicating in their own specific context.
Which is definitely the best way to handle material this dense. And as we set the stage for you, I want to address the elephant in the room immediately.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah, because when we start talking about a populated unseen realm or a divine council or territorial spirits, the immediate fear for anyone rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that we are abandoning monotheism.
Right. It sounds like we're introducing a pagan pantheon of competing gods.
Exactly. But the research is absolutely adamant we are not. We are simply expanding the lens to encompass the epic, unseen cosmic hierarchy that the prophets, the apostles, and the early church universally accepted. It is about adding ancient depth to the idea of one supreme creator who governs a very complex reality.
It's a crucial distinction. We aren't throwing out monotheism. We're trying to understand what monotheism actually meant to an ancient Israelite.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are going to dive into a populated spiritual realm, we have to start with the absolute unbreakable anchor of the biblical text, which is the singular sovereignty of God.
The foundation.
Right. The text fiercely and repeatedly asserts that there is only one God. That is the bedrock. You cannot understand the cosmic architecture without first establishing who sits at the very top. So let's look at the Old Testament anchors first.
The most famous one, of course, is the Shema.
Yes, in Deuteronomy 6.4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is the central defining confession of faith for Israel. God isn't just the greatest among a council of equals. He alone is God. And as you move into the prophetic books, like Isaiah, the language becomes incredibly exclusive.
The book of Isaiah reads almost like a relentless legal defense of God's uniqueness. It isn't just making a casual theological statement. It is a direct polemic against the surrounding nations.
Look at Isaiah 45. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. That people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. Or Isaiah 44.6, where it says, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God.
It covers past, present, and future. Total exclusivity.
And we see this completely preserved in the New Testament. Jesus himself quotes the Shema in Mark 12 when he's asked about the most important commandment.
And the Apostle Paul writes the same thing in 1 Corinthians 8. He says that an idol has no real existence and there is no God but one. He tells Timothy that there is one God and one mediator.
So across the entire library of Scripture, from beginning to end, the claim is perfectly consistent. There is only one God.
The consistency is absolutely there. But here is the critical distinction that Michael Heiser's work brings to the forefront And this is where the paradigm shift really begins for you as a listener.
This is the turning point.
Right. The biblical concept of monotheism does not mean only one spiritual being exists. That is a post-Enlightenment modern Western assumption. We tend to flatten the spiritual world into just God, maybe a few angels with wings playing harps, and some vague demonic forces.
Like bad vibes?
Exactly, just abstract bad vibes. But when the biblical writers insist there is only one God, they mean something very, very specific. They mean no other being is uncreated.
So it's a distinction of origins. It's about ontological uniqueness.
Precisely. It is about what kind of being he is. No other being is the source of all things. No other entity is worthy of worship. If you look at the ancient Near Eastern comparative literature, like the Ugaritic texts that scholars often use to understand the Canaanite religion, you see true pantheons.
You see gods who are born.
Gods who are born, gods who die, gods who fight each other for the throne, like Baal and Yum. In Greek mythology, Zeus overthrows his father Cronus. There is a duplicity of power. But in the biblical worldview, there is zero duplicity.
There is no true pantheon competing with the Creator as equals.
None. All other spiritual beings, no matter how powerful they are, were created by Yahweh, are subordinate to Yahweh, and are ultimately accountable to Yahweh.
Okay, I want to push back on that slightly, or at least play devil's advocate for a moment. Because if we start acknowledging all these other powerful spiritual entities, and as we are going to see, the text sometimes calls them gods, doesn't that inherently dilute the supremacy of Yahweh? How did the ancient Israelites reconcile that without slipping into the polytheism of their neighbors?
They reconciled it through the concept of administration. Acknowledging a hierarchy does not dilute the supremacy of the one at the top. It actually emphasizes it.
Give me an example of how that works.
Think of a massive multinational corporation. There is only one founder and CEO who holds all the ultimate equity and authority. Acknowledging that the CEO has appointed regional managers, vice presidents, and department heads doesn't mean you think there are multiple CEOs.
Yeah.
It just means the CEO has a staff. The biblical text teaches one supreme, uncreated God, while simultaneously recognizing a vast array of created spiritual beings who have been delegated specific roles, responsibilities, and genuine authority in the universe.
That makes perfect sense. The existence of the regional managers doesn't threaten the founder. Which brings us to the textual tension that forces modern readers to actually confront this reality. Because if we have established that there is only one God, what are we supposed to do with a text like Psalm 82?
Well, this is the big one.
This is the text that usually makes modern monotheists very nervous. The psalm opens with this scene. God stands in the divine assembly. In the midst of the gods, he judges.
That verse is a massive stumbling block for the modern, flattened view of the spiritual world. For centuries, a lot of commentators have tried to creatively reinterpret that verse to avoid the discomfort of the word gods.
Yeah, the classic workaround I've heard is that these gods are just human judges or corrupt earthly politicians in Israel. Like, God is just holding a town hall meeting with bad mayors.
Right, that is the traditional evasion. But Heiser argues aggressively against that, using pure linguistics in ancient Near Eastern context. The Hebrew in Psalm 82 says, Elohim stands in the council of El. Among the Elohim he judges.
It uses the exact same word.
Exactly. Heiser demonstrates that in the original language and context, these cannot be human beings. God is not holding court with mortal politicians in a heavenly assembly. These are spiritual beings. They are members of the unseen heavenly host.
But if they are spiritual beings and the text explicitly calls them Elohim, aren't we right back to the polytheism problem?
Only if you misunderstand how the ancient Hebrew mind used the word Elohim. This is the absolute core of Heiser's linguistic work. We have been conditioned to read Elohim as a specific personal name for the Creator, just another way to say God with a capital G. But in biblical Hebrew, it is not a name, it is a categorical term.
Explain what you mean by a categorical term.
It is a word used to describe any entity whose proper natural place of residence is the spiritual realm rather than the physical earthly realm.
Oh, wow. So it is essentially a geographical identifier. Spiritual geography.
Yes.
If your native domain is the physical world, your category is human or animal. If your native domain is the unseen world, your category is Elohim.
Exactly. It describes a domain of existence, not a specific set of attributes. Therefore, Yahweh is an Elohim because his primary domain is the spiritual realm. But an angel is also an Elohim. A demon is an Elohim.
It's just a placeholder for a resident of the spiritual world.
Right. In 1 Samuel 28, when the witch of Endor summons the disembodied spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel, she screams and says, "I see an Elohim coming up out of the earth." Now, Samuel wasn't the creator of the universe. He was a deceased human whose spirit was now residing in the unseen realm.
That completely reorganizes how you read the Old Testament. So Yahweh is an Elohim, but the text is careful to maintain that no other Elohim is Yahweh.
Precisely. Returning to the corporate analogy, the CEO is an employee of the company. The mailroom clerk is also an employee of the company. They share that categorical title.
But the mailroom clerk is definitively not the CEO.
Exactly. Yahweh is uncreated, omnipotent, and sovereign. The other Elohim in the council are created, limited, and subordinate. Because of that linguistic reality, the biblical authors could write about an assembly of Elohim while still fiercely insisting that only one of them is the uncreated sovereign who actually deserves worship.
And once you have that lens, you start seeing this populated realm everywhere. It isn't just Psalm 82, take 1 Kings 22. This is an incredible narrative.
I love this text.
The prophet Micaiah is called before King Ahab of Israel and King Jehoshaphat of Judah, who are trying to decide if they should go to war. Micaiah says, "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing beside him." It is a full throne room scene. And God actually opens the floor for discussion. He asks the host, "Who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?"
It is a genuine administrative council meeting. God has decreed the end result, Ahab's downfall. But he is crowdsourcing the method from his spiritual administration.
He's taking pitches.
He literally is. The text says one spirit offered one idea and another offered a different idea, until finally one spirit steps forward and says, "I will entice him by being a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And God authorizes it. He says, "You are to entice him and you shall succeed. Go out and do so."
You see a similar dynamic in Daniel chapter 7, where the Ancient of Days takes his seat and it says the court sat in judgment and the books were opened. It is a vast array of spiritual authorities. The biblical authors fully believed the universe was governed through this complex, unseen administration. God doesn't micromanage every single detail completely alone. He utilizes a divine council.
And this brings us to a massive turning point in the research. Because this administration wasn't just sitting around in heaven having abstract debates. They were given very specific geographic and geopolitical assignments regarding humanity.
This is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. The research we are looking at hinges on verses 8 and 9 of Deuteronomy 32. And we really need to take our time here because there is a fascinating textual history behind these verses that changes everything. What is happening in this text?
It involves one of the most significant translation corrections in modern biblical scholarship. For a long time, standard English translations like the King James or early editions of the NIV rendered Deuteronomy 32.8, something like this. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel.
Which, if you pause and think about the historical timeline of the Bible, doesn't make any logical sense.
It makes zero sense. The verse is referring back to the division of the nations at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. At that point in the biblical timeline, Israel did not exist. Abraham hadn't even been called yet.
Right.
There were no sons of Israel to base the numbering of the global nations on. It is an anachronism.
So how did it end up reading Sons of Israel in our modern Bibles?
It goes back to the textual transmission of the Hebrew Bible. For centuries, the primary Hebrew text used for translation was the Masoretic text, which was finalized by Jewish scribes in the Middle Ages. In that specific manuscript tradition, it said Sons of Israel. But scholars always suspected that was an edit made later in history, perhaps to tone down the supernatural implications of the original text.
To make it less weird.
Exactly, to domesticate the text. And their suspicions were confirmed by two major discoveries.
The Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Break those down for us because it is important for you listening to understand why a Greek translation and some scrolls in a cave have the authority to correct a modern English Bible.
So the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that was created by Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, around the 3rd century BC, so hundreds of years before the time of Jesus, and over a millennium before the Masoretic text was finalized. In the Septuagint, Deuteronomy 32.8 doesn't say sons of Israel. It translates the phrase as angels of God. And then, in the mid-20th century, we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. These are the absolute oldest surviving Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament. And when scholars rolled out the scroll for Deuteronomy, they found the original Hebrew phrase. It wasn't sons of Israel, it was Bene Elohim, the sons of God.
The exact same phrase used in Genesis 6 and Job 1 to describe the heavenly host, the members of the divine council. So modern translations like the ESV and the updated NIV have officially corrected the verse. It now reads, "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God."
And the theological implications of that correction are just staggering. It connects directly to the events of the Tower of Babel.
Let's talk about Babel. In Genesis 11, humanity gathers together on the plains of Shinar to build a tower with its top in the heavens. I think most people are taught that this is just a neat little origin story to explain why humans speak different languages. It is treated as a story about human pride, God getting annoyed, confusing their speech, and forcing them to spread out.
Right, like a linguistic parlor trick.
Yeah. But the research argues it is infinitely darker and more cosmic than that.
Babel is essentially a story of cosmic divorce. You have to remember the context. Humanity had already rebelled in Eden. The spiritual realm had rebelled in Genesis 6 with the Watchers. Now, post-flood, humanity collectively refuses God's mandate to spread out and fill the earth. Instead, they centralize.
They build a tower.
They built a ziggurat,
Yeah.
which in the ancient Near East was specifically designed as a descending staircase to bring a deity down to be housed in a temple where humans could manipulate it.
Yeah.
It is peak spiritual rebellion.
So God's response isn't just, I'm going to mix up your dictionaries.
No, his response is disinheritance. God essentially says, if you absolutely refuse to live under my direct immediate rule, I am letting you go. I am disinheriting you. He disperses the nations, confuses the languages, and according to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, he formally allots those 70 nations to the administration of lesser heavenly beings, the sons of God in his divine council.
Wow.
He hands geopolitical control of the earth over to subordinate spiritual jurisdictions.
He assigns the nations to the regional managers. And then, the very next verse, Deuteronomy 32.9, provides the counter-move that sets up the rest of the entire biblical narrative. Verse 8 says, he divided the nations according to the sons of God. Verse 9 says, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage.
It is brilliant. Having disinherited the 70 nations of the world, Yahweh immediately pivots. In Genesis 12, literally just one chapter after Babel, he calls a single childless man named Abram out of Ur. God decides, I'm going to build a brand new nation from scratch. They will be my portion. They will be under my direct personal jurisdiction.
That is the cosmic geography of the Old Testament. The world map is divided into two distinct spiritual zones. There is Israel, which is Yahweh's personal territory, and there are the 70 Gentile nations, which are under the jurisdiction of the Elohim of the Divine Council.
But there's a massive problem, which the text eventually addresses. Those subordinate spiritual rulers didn't govern the way they were supposed to.
Right. They went rogue.
They went completely rogue. The assignment was presumably to govern the nations justly on God's behalf. But instead, these entities became corrupt. They accepted and eventually demanded the worship of the humans in their jurisdictions. They essentially set themselves up as rival deities.
So when we read the Old Testament and hear about the gods of the surrounding nations, Baal and Canaan, Chemosh and Moab, Milcom and Ammon, Dagon and Philistia, the ancient Israelite wasn't thinking, oh, look at those silly foreigners worshiping an imaginary statue made of wood and stone.
Absolutely not. The biblical worldview does not assume these are mere figments of the ancient imagination. The statues are just wood and stone, yes, and the prophets mock the idols themselves. But the entities behind the idols are understood to be real, rebellious, spiritual beings who hold actual jurisdictional power over those geographic territories.
The entities are real.
Very real. Paul explicitly says this in the New Testament when he writes to the Corinthians, that the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God.
And this brings us full circle right back to Psalm 82. We have the context now. God stands in the divine assembly, in the midst of the gods he judges. The psalm goes on to accuse these specific, corrupt Elohim of ruling unjustly. Verse 2. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Verse 5. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken.
Because these regional managers have rebelled, the entire cosmic order of the earth is chaotic.
And what is the verdict? God strips them of their divine immortality. He issues a cosmic death sentence. Verse 6 and 7. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince.
It's a judgment for geographic mismanagement and spiritual treason.
It is absolutely fascinating. This framework takes texts that seem obscure or disconnected and weaves them into a unified epic narrative. And to prove that this isn't just abstract high-level theology, the research transitions into the historical narratives.
Right, because we need to see how this works on the ground.
Exactly. It shows us how the biblical authors applied this cosmic geography to the actual physical events happening in the story. We are going to look at three bizarre stories from the Old Testament that frankly make zero sense to a modern reader, but when you apply the divine council worldview, they become perfectly logical.
These narratives are where the theology becomes incredibly practical for the ancient mind. Let's get into them.
Let's start with Naaman. This is in 2 Kings chapter 5. To set the scene, Naaman is the commander of the army of Syria. He is a highly successful, powerful, wealthy man, but he contracts leprosy. In the ancient world, that is a slow, isolating death sentence. Through a captured Israelite servant girl, he hears that there is a prophet in Israel named Elisha who might be able to cure him.
So Naaman loads up with silver, gold, and fine clothing and makes the diplomatic trek down to Israel.
And the interaction is famously anticlimactic. Naaman expects the prophet to come out, wave his hands over the leprosy, and call upon his God. Instead, Elisha doesn't even come to the door. He sends a messenger telling Naaman to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times.
Naaman is furious. He complains that the rivers in Damascus, Syria, are far superior to the muddy Jordan River. But his servants convinces him to swallow his pride. He goes down, dips in the Jordan 7 times, and his flesh is completely restored.
It is a miraculous healing. Naaman rushes back to Elisha, absolutely awestruck. He declares, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." He tries to pay Elisha. Elisha refuses the money. And then, as Naaman is packing up to head back to Syria, he makes a request that is utterly baffling to a modern reader.
Right. He says, "If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth, for from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord."
He asks for dirt, 2 mule loads of Israelite dirt to take back to Syria as a souvenir. If you look at this through a modern lens, it seems wildly superstitious. Like he thinks the soil itself possesses magical healing properties, or he needs it as a psychological crutch.
But if you look at it through the lens of cosmic geography, Naaman's logic is flawless. Think about his situation. He lives in Damascus, Syria. In the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, Syria is a Gentile nation. It was disinherited at Babel.
Okay.
Therefore, Syria is under the jurisdiction of a subordinate Elohim. And the text actually names the deity later in the chapter, Rimmon. Naaman's physical address is inside the territory of Rimmon.
But Naaman has just realized that Yahweh is the Most High. He wants to worship Yahweh exclusively.
Exactly. But how do you worship the God of Israel when you physically live in a territory owned by Rimmon? In the ancient mind, a deity's presence and authority are intrinsically tied to their allotted land. Yahweh's portion is Israel. So Naaman needs a patch of Yahweh's jurisdiction. By taking 2 mule loads of Israelite dirt back to Damascus, he's effectively creating a geographical loophole.
He's building a portable embassy.
That is exactly what he is doing. He is importing sacred ground so that when he offers a sacrifice, he is physically standing on Yahweh's territory, even while geographically located behind enemy lines in Syria. He is honoring the boundary lines of cosmic geography while remaining faithful to the Most High.
And the proof that this isn't just pagan superstition is Elisha's response. Elisha doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't give a theological lecture saying, "Naaman, God is omnipresent, you don't need dirt." Elisha simply says, "Go in peace." Elisha fully understands and validates the geographic dilemma Naaman is facing.
It's perfectly logical in their worldview.
Okay, that brings us to the second narrative, the threshold of Dagon in 1 Samuel 5.
This is a story of literal territorial warfare between deities.
The Israelites are at war with the Philistines. The Israelites foolishly decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant into battle, thinking it will act as a lucky charm. It doesn't work. The Philistines slaughter them and capture the Ark. To the Philistines, this is the ultimate victory. They take the Ark back to their capital city, Ashdod, and place it inside the temple of their national god, Dagon, as a war trophy.
In the ancient Near East, capturing a nation's idol or sacred object and putting it at the feet of your own god was the ultimate declaration of supremacy. It meant Dagon had defeated Yahweh.
But Yahweh doesn't play by those rules. The next morning, the Philistines go into the temple, and the idol of Dagon has fallen face down on the ground in front of the ark. It looks like Dagon is bowing in submission.
The priests probably assume it was an earthquake or a clumsy accident. They prop Dagon back up.
But the next morning, it happens again. Except this time, the text says Dagon's head And both his hands are broken off and lying on the threshold of the temple. Only the torso is left intact. And then the biblical author includes this incredibly specific detail. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day.
It was a dark, almost comedic scene, but the theological implications are massive. To understand it, you have to understand the significance of a temple threshold in the ancient world. A temple wasn't just a church building where people gathered to sing. It was believed to be the literal, physical house of the deity on earth.
So it's their actual residence.
Right, and the threshold, the doorway, was the boundary line. It was the demarcation point between the profane outside world and the sacred domain of the god.
It is a border crossing.
Exactly. When the Philistines bring the ark into Ashdod, they are bringing the localized presence of Yahweh into Philistine territory. When they put it in the temple, Yahweh is entirely on Dagon's turf. But the decapitation and dismemberment of the idol, specifically on the threshold, is a highly calculated supernatural humiliation.
Explain the specific body parts.
The head represents the deity's identity and authority. The hands represent the deity's power and ability to act. Yahweh severs them and tosses them directly on the borderline.
It is as if Yahweh is saying, you thought you brought a prisoner of war into your territory, but I just executed your territorial ruler on his own front porch. And the reaction of the priests proves it. Why won't they step on the threshold anymore?
Because they recognize that the threshold has been permanently claimed. It has been marked by a superior power. That boundary line no longer belongs to Dagon. Yahweh has conquered that space. The ancient mind viewed this as a genuine historical collision of cosmic jurisdictions.
This makes the Old Testament narratives read like a geopolitical thriller, but with supernatural actors. Let's look at one more example of this. Our third narrative is David's complaint in 1 Samuel 26.
This one is very revealing about the mindset of the average Israelite.
The context here is that King Saul has become deeply paranoid and is hunting David across the wilderness of Judea, trying to kill him. David is constantly on the run, moving from cave to cave. Finally, David gets an opportunity to speak to Saul from a distance, and he makes a profound complaint. He says, "If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, 'Go, serve other gods.'"
Now, anyone who knows the story of David knows he is fiercely devoted to Yahweh. He writes half the Psalms praising the one true God. He has no desire whatsoever to worship foreign idols.
Right, so why in the world does he accuse Saul of forcing him to go serve other gods? Saul isn't demanding David bow to a statue. Saul just wants David dead or out of the country.
Because David's theology is fundamentally rooted in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. He understands that the physical land of Israel is the heritage of the Lord. It is Yahweh's allotted portion. The nations surrounding Israel are under the jurisdiction of the other Elohim.
So leaving is a spiritual problem.
David knows that if Saul's persecution successfully drives him across the border, whether into Philistia or Moab, he is physically stepping out of Yahweh's direct jurisdiction and into the territory governed by rival spiritual entities.
He equates physical exile with spiritual exile. To leave the geography of Israel is to be thrust into the political domain of other gods. It is a theological crisis for him, not just a physical survival crisis.
These three narratives, Naaman hacking the system with dirt, the ark claiming the threshold of Dagon, and David's fear of crossing the border, demonstrate how deeply this cosmic geography was embedded in the ancient Israelite mind. It wasn't an abstract theory, it was the reality of the map they lived on.
And as we move forward in the biblical timeline, this worldview doesn't fade away. It doesn't get replaced by a more enlightened or abstract theology. The research shows that it actually escalates. The geographic tensions of the historical books evolve into outright visible cosmic warfare in the prophetic literature and the New Testament.
It becomes much more explicit. You see the curtain pulled back to reveal the direct link between human empires and spiritual forces.
The prime example of this is in the book of Daniel. Let's talk about Daniel 10. Daniel is in exile in Babylon, which has just been conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. He receives a terrifying vision of a great conflict, and he spends 3 weeks mourning, fasting, and praying for understanding. Finally, a spectacular heavenly messenger appears to him, and the messenger gives an almost casual explanation for why it took him 21 days to show up.
Right, the messenger says, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me." And then later in the chapter, the messenger says, "Now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come."
Now, obviously, we're not talking about human politicians here. Cyrus the Great or some Persian general doesn't have the capacity to intercept an angelic being in the spiritual realm and hold him in a wrestling match for 3 weeks.
No, these princes are the spiritual rulers assigned to those nations. This is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, fully realized centuries later. The empires of Persia and Greece have supernatural entities who have claimed authority over them. These are the corrupt sons of God actively resisting God's purposes in history.
So Daniel 10 is showing us that human geopolitics, the rise and fall of the Persian and Greek empires, is the earthly manifestation of warfare happening in the unseen realm.
Exactly. And this framework completely shatters the idea that the New Testament abandons the Old Testament's supernatural worldview. Because I think a lot of modern Christians assume that once Jesus arrives, all this talk of territorial spirits and cosmic geography just vanishes. We get civilized, we get abstract.
But the apostles double down on it.
They absolutely do, and you cannot understand the Apostle Paul without this background. The famous passage is Ephesians 6.12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places.
We hear principalities and powers all the time in modern religious discourse, but usually it gets heavily psychologized. It becomes a metaphor for systemic injustice or toxic political structures or just internal struggle against sin.
And while those things are real, Paul, as a first-century Jewish scholar trained in the Hebrew Scriptures, isn't speaking in metaphors. He is referencing the exact territorial spiritual authorities we have been discussing. The rulers and authorities are the corrupted Elohim of the nations.
He's being literal.
Very literal. Paul is telling the early Christian church in Ephesus, which, by the way, was the epicenter of pagan Artemis worship. He's saying, your ultimate enemy isn't the Roman Empire. Your enemy isn't the local magistrate throwing you in prison. Those are just the flesh and blood puppets. Your fight is against the unseen cosmic powers pulling the strings of those empires.
It makes the New Testament feel dangerous. It is deeply subversive. But where this cosmic warfare reaches its absolute zenith is in the apocalyptic literature, specifically the Book of Revelation. The research points out how understanding cosmic geography actually decodes the bizarre, surreal imagery in Revelation. Let's look at the concept of the sea and the beast.
This is where the symbolism locks right into the cosmic geography.
In Revelation 13, John sees a terrifying beast with 7 heads and 10 horns rising out of the sea. Now, if you read that without ancient context, it sounds like a literal sea monster. It sounds like Godzilla.
But apocalyptic literature is highly symbolic, and the text usually provides the cipher to crack it. Later in Revelation 17, an angel explicitly tells John what the waters represent. The angel says, the waters that you saw are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages.
Nations and languages. That phrase is a direct hyperlink back to the Tower of Babel. It represents the chaotic, disinherited mass of the Gentile nations. So the sea isn't a body of salt water. It is a symbol for the collective political and social system of the world.
Therefore, the beast rising from the sea represents a massive, oppressive human empire emerging from the world system. Whether that was Rome in the 1st century or a future geopolitical power, it is a human political structure. But here's the critical connection. Revelation 13.2 says, and to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority.
And Revelation explicitly identifies the dragon as Satan, the ancient serpent.
Exactly. So the message is clear and perfectly aligned with the worldview we've traced from Deuteronomy to Daniel to Paul. The ultimate oppressive political structures of human history derive their power, their throne, and their authority from rebellious supernatural rulers. Human empires are the avatars of the dragon.
God's sovereignty in history is exercised in direct conflict against real, active spiritual powers who hold geographic and political territory.
Yes, and to truly grasp the scale of this conflict, the research suggests we need to look at the physical terrain itself. Because cosmic geography isn't just horizontal. It isn't just about drawing borders on a map and saying this nation belongs to this entity. It is also vertical.
Which brings us to a fascinating segment of our deep dive, the sacred peaks.
In the ancient Near Eastern worldview, geography was theology, and mountains were the ultimate cosmic markers. They were believed to be the meeting points between heaven and earth. They were the literal dwelling places of the gods, the locations where the divine councils assembled.
And the biblical authors don't shy away from that cultural concept. They co-opt it to declare Yahweh's supremacy. The research highlights 3 specific mountains that become major players in this cosmic drama: Zion, Hermon, and Bashan. Let's start with the anchor, Mountain 1, Zion. This is the mountain associated with Jerusalem.
Zion is presented throughout Scripture as the legitimate cosmic mountain. It is the headquarters of the Most High.
Psalm 48 says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King." And Psalm 132 says, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever."
Every surrounding nation claimed that their specific deity lived on a sacred mountain. The Canaanites believed Baal lived on Mount Zaphon in the north. The biblical texts are aggressively asserting that all those other claims are fraudulent. Zion is the true cosmic mountain because Yahweh has chosen to manifest his presence there. It is God's beachhead on an earth that is largely controlled by hostile spiritual forces.
Okay, so Zion is the capital of Yahweh's territory. But then we contrast that with Mountain 2, Hermon. Mount Hermon sits way up on the northern border of ancient Israel. And the history of this mountain in the ancient Jewish mind is incredibly dark. To explain why, the research brings in Second Temple Jewish traditions, specifically literature like the Book of Enoch.
We need to pause and explain the Book of Enoch because it is crucial context. The Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish text that is not considered canonical scripture by most Jewish or Christian traditions today. However, it was immensely popular and highly influential during the time of Jesus.
The biblical authors knew it.
Very well. The New Testament authors were very familiar with it. Jude even quotes from it directly. The importance of Enoch is that it provides a crystal clear window into how the Jewish people of the first century understood the spiritual realm.
And what does the Enochian tradition say about Mount Hermon?
It identifies Mount Hermon as ground zero for supernatural rebellion. In Genesis chapter 6, there is a brief, strange story about the sons of God coming down and mingling with the daughters of men, creating the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch expands on that narrative. It says that a group of 200 angels, known as the Watchers, made a pact to rebel against God. And it explicitly states that the exact geographical location where they descended to earth to initiate this rebellion was the summit of Mount Hermon.
So in the ancient mind, Mount Hermon carries an incredibly heavy, ominous, symbolic weight. It is the literal birthplace of demonic corruption on earth. It is enemy headquarters.
Exactly. And once you know that cultural geography, a very specific event in the New Testament becomes absolutely explosive.
This was the part of the research that completely blew my mind. Let's look at the New Testament reversal. In Matthew 16, Jesus takes his disciples on a retreat. They hike way up north to a region called Caesarea Philippi. What is the geographical location of Caesarea Philippi?
It is located directly at the base of Mount Hermon. It is nestled in the foothills of the Mountain of Rebellion. Furthermore, Caesarea Philippi was a center of pagan worship. It had a massive temple dedicated to the Greek god Pan, built into a cave that the locals literally called the Gates of Hades.
So Jesus deliberately marches his disciples away from the safety of Jewish territory, away from Mount Zion, and leads them into the most spiritually dark, pagan, rebellious piece of real estate in the entire region. He takes them to the foot of enemy headquarters.
Right into the lion's den.
And right there, in the shadow of Hermon, Jesus stops and asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter speaks up and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And how does Jesus respond?
He says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it."
He is throwing down the gauntlet. The rock he is referring to isn't just Peter's confession. Geographically, he is standing at the rock of Mount Hermon. He is standing at the gates of Hades.
It is a cosmic declaration of war. He is saying, I am the true king, I am the Son of the Most High, and my assembly, my church, is going to storm the gates of your domain. We are taking the territory back, and your demonic defenses will not be able to hold us out. It is a massive, aggressive territorial claim.
I have read that story 100 times in Sunday school, and I always pictured it as a peaceful pastoral moment where Jesus is just asking a theological survey question. I never realized the geography was the punchline. It is a military briefing on the front lines.
The geography changes the whole tone of the passage.
Which brings us to Mountain 3, Bashan. Bashan is a region northeast of the Sea of Galilee. It is roughly what we call the Golan Heights today. And historically, the Old Testament gives Bashan a very sinister reputation.
Bashan was strongly associated with the Rephaim, the giants. King Og of Bashan, who the Israelites defeat in the Book of Numbers, is described as the last remnant of the Rephaim. In ancient Ugaritic texts, the region of Bashan was viewed as the physical entrance to the underworld, the realm of the dead. It was a place of profound spiritual opposition.
And the Psalms pick up on this. Psalm 68 portrays Bashan as a rival mountain, a hostile entity that is jealous of God's mountain. It says, O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan, why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode?
The geography is anthropomorphized to represent the spiritual forces ruling those regions. Bashan is glaring at Zion with hatred because Zion is the seat of Yahweh's authority.
So the overarching takeaway from this section on the sacred peaks is profound. Geographic locations in the Bible are not mere topography. They aren't just details thrown in to make the story seem historical. They are deep markers of cosmic order and spiritual power. The biblical story of salvation is literally mapped out across these spiritual battle lines.
Which brings us to the crucial pivot of this entire deep dive. We have walked through the foundation of monotheism, the linguistic reality of the Elohim, the disinheritance at Babel, the historical narratives of territorial warfare, the prophetic visions of empires, and the cosmic geography of the mountains. But we have to synthesize this. We have to address the so what.
Exactly. Why does this matter? If I am a listener, navigating the complexities of modern life, going to work, raising a family, what is the harm if I just stick to a flat, simple reading of the Bible? Why do I need to care about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview?
Because if you flatten the text, you strip the biblical narrative of its explanatory power. You lose the connective tissue that holds the entire story together.
Let's list out the consequences of ignoring this cosmic geography based on the logical progression we've tracked today. First, you lose the biblical rationale for the state of the world. Why are the nations so hostile to God? If you ignore Babel as a cosmic disinheritance, it just becomes a quirky story about languages. You miss the tragedy that humanity was handed over to corrupt spiritual authorities.
Second, you completely misunderstand the New Testament worldview. You end up psychologizing the apostles. When Paul warns about principalities and powers, a flattened worldview forces you to interpret that as just human political debates or internal mental struggles. It strips the early church of its actual supernatural context, making their warning seem outdated or merely metaphorical.
Third, you lose the structure of apocalyptic literature. Revelation becomes a confusing, hallucinogenic fever dream instead of the logical, theological conclusion to a territorial war that started back in Genesis. But most importantly, and this is where the research culminates beautifully, if you miss the cosmic geography, you miss the true magnitude of the gospel mission.
This is where the entire biblical narrative resolves. If the 70 nations were disinherited at Babel and handed over to rebellious Elohim, then what exactly is the goal of the gospel? It is a global reclamation project.
Let's look at the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. The disciples are gathered in Jerusalem, the Holy Spirit descends with fire, and the apostles start speaking in tongues. The text specifically lists out all the different nationalities present in Jerusalem, that day Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Asia, Egypt, Rome. People from all over the known world hear the gospel proclaimed in their own native languages. Again, this is usually taught just as a cool miracle to help evangelism. But what is it through the lens of cosmic geography?
Pentecost is the direct cosmic reversal of Babel. Think about the symmetry. At Babel, God confused the languages and pushed the nations away, dividing them under the authority of lesser powers. At Pentecost, God reaches through the language barrier to gather the nations back to himself. He is broadcasting a signal into the 70 disinherited nations. The exile is over. It is Yahweh reclaiming his territory. He is invading the jurisdictions of the corrupt sons of God.
That gives me chills. God is taking the nations back. And it completely changes how you read the Great Commission. After Jesus resurrects, just before he ascends, he gives his disciples their final orders in Matthew 28. He says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations."
Pay close attention to the legal language there. He doesn't just say, go start a new religion. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. What authority is he talking about? He is talking about the authority that used to belong to the rebellious Elohim. The authority of the Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece, the territorial spirits of the 70 nations.
He is making a cosmic legal claim. By conquering death and rising from the grave, Jesus defeated the dragon. He conquered the systems of the world. And now, he is sending his followers out to repossess the inheritance.
Going back to our corporate analogy one last time, Jesus is announcing that the corrupt regional managers have been officially terminated. Their authority is void. The CEO has taken direct control of the entire map, and he is sending his ambassadors out to every single branch office to announce the change in management.
Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. The nations aren't just target demographics, they are reclaimed territory. I want to emphasize this to you as you listen, missing. This context reduces the depth of your biblical reading. It turns a sweeping, epic narrative of cosmic warfare and territorial reclamation into a flat, highly individualized, moralistic rulebook. Recognizing the divine council worldview illuminates the very real, active spiritual dynamic of the world you live in.
It restores the awe and the massive scale of what the biblical authors were communicating. Yes, God is a singular, uncreated, unrivaled sovereign, but he is a sovereign actively engaged in the triumphant reclamation of a complex, populated universe.
What an incredible journey we've been on today. To briefly recap the logical progression we've tracked in this deep dive, we started by securing the unbreakable foundation of one uncreated God, acknowledging his ontological uniqueness. We then explored the divine council, discovering that Elohim is a categorical term for spiritual beings, proving that a populated unseen realm does not threaten monotheism.
We saw how human geography became a battleground after the cosmic divorce of Babel.
We watched territorial warfare play out practically with Naaman's dirt and Dagon's decapitation on the threshold. We saw the curtain pulled back on geopolitical empires in Daniel and Revelation. We tracked the vertical geography of sacred peaks like Zion and Hermon.
And we culminated with the realization that the events of the New Testament, the cross, the resurrection, Pentecost, and the Great Commission, are the ultimate campaign to reclaim the disinherited nations from corrupt spiritual powers.
It changes everything. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over as you go about your day that builds on the reality of this cosmic geography. If the biblical worldview insists that earthly nations and territories were actively assigned to unseen spiritual entities, and if the events of Pentecost and the Great Commission initiated a global, ongoing, unstoppable campaign to reclaim those exact territories, what does that mean for the physical space you are occupying right now? How does the invisible spiritual map of your own city, your own neighborhood, or even your own workplace change when you realize that you are walking into it carrying the reclaimed absolute authority of the Most High?
That perspective transforms how you view every interaction and every physical location you enter.
It really does. You are an ambassador in reclaimed territory. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. It was a dense, incredibly rich exploration of the text. Keep asking the hard questions, keep digging deeper into the ancient context, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.